Hey everybody, welcome to the BitScoop live stream, our first live stream. Today we're going to be talking about the BitScoop API Toolbox, some of the features that we have coming in the pipes, what you can do with BitScoop API Toolbox now, um, and basically just give you a few examples, go over some of the stuff that we touched on in our videos, tell you what videos are going to come out with next, stuff like that. So just to introduce ourselves, I'm Stephen Barry. I'm the CTO and co-founder of BitScoop Labs.
And I'm Liam Broza, the CEO and co-founder of BitScoop Labs.
So do you want to start with maybe just talking about a general overview of the platform and sort of what it does, what's the point, how it helps developers, that sort of stuff?
Sure.
Yeah.
So we'll be talking about the API Toolbox today. It's BitScoop Labs' first product. It's a platform that allows you to integrate APIs and microservices into any internet-connected software.
If it's right now, it's HTTP and HTTPS.
Yes.
So stuff like like a database that's connected to the internet is not it doesn't work. So it's like it's a microservice and
Yeah.
API, right?
So anything from an app or a website or server-side software, or even something really crazy like a game or augmented reality or virtual reality software.
Yeah.
If you came here from the LaForge optical email list, you might be wondering how you might build augmented reality software, say for the LaForge platform with BitScoop Labs API Toolbox. And it's actually pretty easy. LaForge will be exposing an API just like everybody else does, Facebook, Twitter. So if you come and work on the API Toolbox, you'll find something very different than your normal process of building software. Here you can come to our provider maps, and there will be one for LaForge along with Facebook and Twitter. And say if you were building a Twitter app, you could grab the Twitter provider map, the LaForge provider map.
And we'll go over all that stuff in a demo. So
integrate them together, and now you've created a augmented reality Twitter app. And just like we've now taken two APIs and used them as building blocks to build something, you can take 10 or 15, and they don't just have to be public, they can be private too. So let's step back here for a moment. And
wait, one thing though, because some of the questions we get with the LaForge stuff is it going to be a requirement to work with the BitScoop API Toolbox to work with LaForge?
Oh, yes, that's a great question. Yeah. And let me clarify that right now. So we will be helping build the LaForge platform, and it will be based largely on our technology, the API Toolbox and other things that we have yet to release. And although you do not need the API Toolbox to develop on the LaForge platform, you probably want the API Toolbox because it's going to be what the LaForge platform is based off of, and it's best supported, probably fastest and easiest for development and maintenance. So, Corey Mack, who's actually behind us working the camera, and myself recommend the API Toolbox. So as we go over, as Steve goes over our platform, you might want to look at what we're presenting and get some ideas in mind for how you can build the Forge mods.
One of the, just keep in mind that one of the overarching themes that we approached our product design with is let's keep this as close to HTTP as we can, as standard compliant as we can. So you're out there, you're dealing with a lot of these APIs, and you just get just weird stuff that people do for just arcane reasons that might affect their business or might affect various things. So when we were in past jobs and stuff, we'd have to deal with a lot of these APIs. It just had aberrant behavior. And so the BitScoop API Toolbox is not this heavy lift where it's this whole new paradigm necessarily. It's basically how do you reduce a lot of these standard aberrations, a lot of these aberrations rather, to a standard case where you can just approach it as HTTP and not necessarily have to rely on SDKs, which are just convoluted and perhaps obfuscated. So it's very close to the just native protocol and stuff like that.
So let's take a step back here. If we've lost anybody, just to clarify and make sure everybody's on the same page with us on what we've built. So the API Toolbox allows you to simplify what in software developers call your data pipeline. So if you're building an internet-connected piece of software, you want to bring together 5, 7, 10 data sources, whether that be a database, an API, a microservice, what have you, scraping a web page maybe. Get that together, all that information together in one place and organized. And then from there, you then write your logic in your user interface, and you've built your app. Well, that data pipeline part, the getting the data together, can be as much as 50-70% of your data.
Just to pull out a number.
Yeah, in my
It's like
experience,
95% of your daily problem. Right?
yeah, in my experience, it's a very large part of software development and maintenance.
And of course, depends on your job function. It depends on your particular product, stuff like that. But the point is, it's a very large chunk. Especially moving forward, I mean, we have a lot of services now that are more and more data dependent. So,
and it was always our headache. We came from
right.
consultants. We talked to people who build products and consulting, and they're always like, God, maintaining the data is always the worst part of our job.
Yeah.
So Barry and I, over beers, so many years ago, just kind of sat back and went, God, wouldn't it be amazing if somebody built like a general solution that did this once and for all, that made it, made it really great. So when your data sources changed, or they went down, or you had to pay for an API and you didn't want to make a lot of calls, or you had a rate limited API and you couldn't make very many calls, or an API was getting deprecated, or it was not standard compliant. Like there was some sort of middleware that would just make all these problems go away. So on the other end, I could have this magical data exactly the way I want it. And over the years, we've turned our dream into a reality, and that's what the API Toolbox is.
And there's some meandering along the way. It's just we approached it from a little bit of a different way before, and then use a lot of the technology that we came up with to basically show off where we're at now.
Yeah. So without further ado, we're going to show this product off, the API Toolbox, after all this hype. And we hope you love it.
Yeah.
So Barry, would you like to get into the demo?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just preface this by saying that we, if you followed along our YouTube channel, so we've been putting a lot of stuff up on YouTube, a lot. And there's 5 videos at the time of this recording. But what we're going to do with that is put up a lot more resources, so that we have our demos posted, stuff like that. But we didn't want that to feel like homework or a chore to learn. And we know some of this stuff, you pick up a new technology, it can be a little arcane. So how do you make it easy to use? How do you make it easy to learn? How do you make it maybe a little bit fun to learn? So we wanted to interact with you guys and have more multimedia, if you use a word from the 90s, presentation. How do we do the things we do? Why do we do the things we do? Why do certain things, do we implement them the way we did? So we hope to give you some insight into that, to more or less sanity check ourselves, have you guys sanity check us. We listen to all that sort of feedback. Send us an email, which we'll post in the description. These various videos and stuff. You can give us feedback or respond to that feedback, and maybe you have a chance to shape how this turns out and suit it more to your needs if it doesn't already.
So our emails and our contacts will be on and below the video. And feel free to reach out to us anytime. We're happy to schedule some time for a live stream or a hangout or whatever, and take you through this, because we're very excited to show people.
And so the videos you see up there right now are, we call them intro series videos. They cover very, very basic features of the platform. What we're going to be doing and pushing out, probably not any more intro videos, but what we're going to call workshop videos of solving very particular problems. So if one of our users or one of you guys has an issue that we maybe workshop together, like say, hey, how do we solve this problem? Maybe we have to release a new feature that solves that problem. Okay, let's release a workshop video that addresses that particular issue, that explains that feature without burying it in documentation and stuff like that. So what we're going to go over today is more or less the stuff that was covered in the intro videos, but we're going to also be talking about touching a little bit more on why you would do the things that we've presented here, maybe some examples from our past that make sense to you as well, and that resonate with some of the problems that you face. So what we've done over on the screen here is just logged into a local copy of the API Toolbox. The reason I clarify that is because if you were to sign into the API Toolbox now, the features wouldn't quite match up. So this is a development version that we're going to be deploying relatively soon, but if you notice a difference, that's why. So what I've done is created 5 provider maps that cover more or less those 5 videos, so they line up pretty one-to-one there. And then over on our other screen, we have Postman, And what we use Postman for internally is, in order to develop features, we have to work with APIs, right? So this is an API toolbox. We need to know how APIs work to develop features to simplify APIs. So we got to do all the mundane, awful stuff of dealing with all these APIs designed by people that have legacy features, maybe some strange, questionable design decisions in there, which I'm not really in a position to judge necessarily, but I, as an end user of some of these, do take issue with it. So anyway, we use Postman to generate collections, requests, stuff like that, make requests to the APIs, sort of get our hands wet with it and learn how the API works. So you can use that for developing applications as well. Think of it as like a curl with a graphical interface, I guess, if some of you nerds out there use curl like I do still. All right, so we're going to hop right into I think probably we should touch on what a provider map is and what a data provider is. What do we consider these things, and how do we define them? That'll probably be helpful. A provider, a data provider, is simply anything that has data available over HTTP or HTTPS. I clarify HTTP and HTTPS right now because that's what we support right now. It is possible that if there's enough requests for something like Mongo or SQL, that there will be native support for that, but it's not really on our roadmap right now. So any service or microservice is available over HTTP can be considered a data provider. And in order to describe the behavior of these data providers and pump them through the API toolbox, you write a provider map. So you map a data provider with a provider map. Okay? So what we essentially have is 5 of these provider maps. 4 of them map to JSON placeholder.typecode or typecode.com. Don't actually know how to pronounce that, but that's fine. Who knows? JSON placeholder is actually a library on GitHub, which lets you define more or less a local API with fixtures. So you can serve up data locally and use it to drive test cases, proof out behaviors, and stuff like that. There is also a hosted version, and that's the URL that you can see in these provider maps listed right there. So we're going to go poke at that data provider just to show you what stuff is available really quickly. So if we go ahead and copy this URL out here, and then go ahead and open up another tab up top, you can see that this is basically just a data provider that has resources available, posts, comments, albums, photos, to-dos, and users. We don't really care about a lot of these for the sake of the demo. I mean, we could write a provider map that did all of these, but it'd be a lot of repeated configuration and sort of out of scope. So what we're going to do is focus on just posts and users. So that'll give us just a very small, limited data set of stuff to work with, to understand, and then perhaps extend our example in like a real live use case. We'll link you to a couple demos of examples that we have later. So the point is, let's learn the very, very basics on very, very basic data, and then use those skills to adapt it to real world scenarios, just like you learn something in math or computer science. So let's take a look at our /posts. This is on the data provider. It's basically just a list of posts. Nothing too complicated there. You notice it's a lot of that Latin filler text, so nothing particularly interesting. Let's take a look at users. It's just a list of users. So again, there's nothing particularly interesting. There might be data in here that we don't care about. We're going to address that in a little bit. But this is basically what we're working with. Okay? So let's shut down that tab and then hop back over to the API toolbox here. The first demo, dynamic endpoints. So what is an endpoint and why should you care? Essentially, when you create a provider map, if we open this up, you have a single endpoint here, okay? Whenever you create a provider map, you don't actually need to create endpoints. The bare minimum of working with the API toolbox is just the version that you can see there, and that's the specification version for the API toolbox for the provider map. So eventually, there's only one option right now, it's 1.0. But if we do a 2.0, for instance, that's not backwards compatible, we're not going to make all the 1.0 ones break. We'll just support 2. So that's what that version selector is there. The name is just for organization. It doesn't really affect this at all. And then the URL, like I said, is where this provider map maps to, so the data provider URL, and that's the JSON placeholder. So this provider map right now can be saved, but it just doesn't do anything. So how do we actually call data, get it from the data provider through the API toolbox and back to you? That's where endpoints come in, okay? So we're gonna add back our endpoints and just look at this endpoint right here. We have an endpoint called posts. The naming convention that I've personally decided on for this is posts with the uppercase letter, so Pascal case. But you don't need to do that yourself. If you want lowercase p for posts, or you want to call it foos, it doesn't matter. You do whatever you want. I think, if I recall correctly, I think it's just numbers and letters. There are some character restrictions, but the point is whatever paradigm you want, you can use. You see that this endpoint posts maps to the outbound route /posts. So this /post right here is actually the route on the data provider that we're going to be using, okay? And I'll get to the single override in a second. What I'm going to do is just go ahead and make a call to this just so you can see what's up, right? So let's hop back over to Postman. We're going to open up the collection that corresponds to that provider map, and we're going to send a request to /posts. So you see right here, we're actually querying the BitScoop API Toolbox data API, so provider.api.bitscoop.com / the ID of the provider map / the name of the endpoint, okay? So if we send this, you get all that data back. And that should look awfully familiar if you check back a couple seconds to the screen we had for that data provider. It's the same data, right? We didn't do anything interesting to it. We just queried the data and then returned it through the BitScoop API Toolbox directly to you, all right? So the other endpoint you have on our API from adding an endpoint, so you automatically have two endpoints. You have the collection, which is this with /post without an identifier. But if you want to get a single item, how do you do that? In a lot of RESTful APIs, you might do /posts or whatever the collection is. It doesn't need to be posts, but /post/1, and that one is basically select a post with ID 1 from the list of all posts, right? Should be pretty common behavior that you'll see. So if we do that, you notice we get a single post, okay? How does that work? So let's go back to our provider map and look at the source code. And you can see here, how that works is we've mapped to a different outbound route. So an identifier comes in, and based on the fact that that identifier exists, the API Toolbox knows intelligently to use the single outbound specification as opposed to the collection. If we were to get rid of that single, what would happen is there is no override. So if we go ahead, I don't want to do that. If we go ahead and save this, and then hop back over, and then make this request again, you'll notice that this behavior is probably not what we want, right? We want a single post, so we need to override that outbound route. This will still work, but it's getting the list of all posts because it's not overriding the route, okay? So we go back to, actually, no, we don't need to do this anymore. This example is pretty much exhausted, I would assume. Yeah. Let's move on then. So, plus I forgot to put that stuff on my clipboard. I'm not typing again. So let's go back to our other providers. We're going to be building on top of that example, so you'll see it again. But let's go ahead and talk about some of the features that you can add on top of this. The ones that we're going to be covering are basically, like I said, the scope of those intro videos we have. So we're going to add models to an endpoint, or model to an endpoint. It's one-to-one. We're going to talk about how you might start to stipulate relationships between different endpoints using modeling. We're going to talk about caching, and then we're going to talk about authentication. Okay, so we're going to try to move through this at a reasonable clip now that we've introduced that very basic behavior.
Can we stop for one moment
sure,
just to review? So what you've shown off here is how to connect an API to the API Toolbox.
That's correct.
So now what you should know at the bare minimum is
keep in mind though that there's no like active connection between that's used colloquially. So there's no active connection between the API Toolbox and that data provider. Every time a request goes into the API Toolbox, it's going to make a request outbound. So
let me be very particular in my words, just to clarify. We have added a map to the API Toolbox. So now the API Toolbox understands an external data source. So with just the skills we've learned so far, you can take as many APIs as you want and consolidate them under the API toolbox. And many other services do just that. But what comes next is really the interesting part.
I'll say,
Because,
yeah, could be.
because in my opinion, it is. Because it's not just consolidating. Now what we're going to show is now that we've consolidated these different APIs and microservices into the API toolbox,
Yeah.
we now have a playground to manipulate these APIs in the way that we want them to get the output we want. And we do this on the API toolbox without any code, without dealing with any nonsense of languages and what have you, or SDKs.
Yes.
We're building something totally lightweight and configurable.
Yeah.
Now with that in mind, I'll let you continue.
No, that's definitely good to clarify. Especially because we don't have. This is a pre-recorded live stream because we had some issues with our previous live stream, so we don't have the active questions.
Yeah.
So yeah, any clarifications are good. And also, just to reiterate, if you got any questions, just send us an email and we'll be happy to clarify more.
info@bitscoop.com.
Yeah. Right. Okay, so modeling. These features are interesting to us because we created them, obviously. Not all of them are necessarily interesting to you in your application, but you need to know what you can do so that you can perhaps start to think about how you would solve problems that you might have. So the reason I bring that up is because you might say, well, I need to do modeling to use the API toolbox. No, you don't. You absolutely don't need to do modeling. I need to add relationships to use the API toolbox. No, you don't. You can do them if you want to, but you don't have to. Same thing with caching, it's optional. And honestly, the same thing with the authentication. And we'll touch on this in the authentication in a little bit, but the authentication can almost be used, actually can be used as a standalone feature. So if you don't want to proxy any data through the API toolbox and you just want to use this for authentication, you can do that. So we designed this in a very modular sort of way so that you're not married to a platform. You can gradually get on, you can gradually get off. We don't keep you here and force you to stay. We allow you to export pretty much all your data and import data. So we want to make that easy on you out of respect for the applications that you've already built.
And that's why we named it the API Toolbox,
yes,
because we want you
correct.
to think of it as a toolbox where you can go in and use the tools you want when you need them, no more, no less. And it's very flexible and modular.
Right. So you'll see, if you go to our main site, you'll see the various things that problems you can solve with the API Toolbox. And we like to think in terms of solving everything with the API Toolbox because that illustrates the example very well. But we also wanted to communicate how independent those features can be. Okay, so with that said, models for filtering and parsing. Why might we want to model data and filter it and parse it? Modeling can let us filter fields, which may be a big deal because you might be querying data into something like a phone app, right? So you have a very limited amount of memory. You maybe are built based on your network, the amount of data that goes through your network. So you want to keep an eye on these things. You want to optimize it where you can. You might just have fields that are just redundant and useless that you want to filter from your data. So we let you filter the data at the source. Obviously, we filter it on the API toolbox, but we consider that, and you could consider that the source in your application, right? So the data comes to us, we filter out the fields that need to be filtered and pass it on to you. Okay, so let's open up the modeling example here. So we've sneakily added this extra endpoint called users, and the reason we did that is because it demonstrates a different aspect of modeling than the post-modeling will. But let's dive right into that and see what you can do. So we have our post, the data coming back from /posts, okay? And all we've done to this, the only difference here is that we've added a model specification, okay? So we have the key, and the key is necessary to identify the model, and it's important for creating relationships. So it's basically the ID of the model, right? And then the fields specify which fields you actually want to include in the output. So if we look at our raw data over here, you can see that we have a user ID, the ID, and the title and the body. Okay. Let's say for the purposes of our web application or phone app or whatever, we don't care about the body. All right. Instead of pulling perhaps thousands and thousands of bodies into our application and discarding them, but in the process using tons of RAM to decode it and turn it into JSON objects and then discard the actual data. Let's go ahead and see how we can filter that at the source using the API Toolbox. Well, we just list the fields we want to whitelist here. So we have the ID, it's an integer, the user ID is an integer, and the title is a string. We don't include the body, so we shouldn't see the body. Okay. So if we go over here and make the request to the collection models, let's go ahead and shrink the basic collection because we don't care about that one anymore, and make a request to a post instance, you get what you'd expect. So it's a single post /post/1, and it has all the data except the body. Great. That's working as intended. So if we go back over and look at the user's endpoint, we have the fields ID, name, username, and email. Okay. So if we look, I'm going to probably have to open up the example here that we had on the data provider, so we can compare the data between what you'd get using the API Toolbox with the modeling and just raw. Okay, so you can see a lot of data here with our user. We have the ID, we have the name, username, email, address. Let's say we don't care about the address. We've already learned how to filter stuff, so we know how to do with that. We just don't include it in the field specification. But you notice here we have email. Okay, the email could, in theory, be a name associated with an email address and an actual address. So you ever see that format with the two, what are they called, carrots? I guess they're carrots. Yeah. I don't know. They look greater, Pac-Man less than or greater than, right? The email address might be between those, and then the name might be included. We support stuff like parsing dates, parsing email addresses like that. The reason we do that is, again, in that theme of parsing at the source. And sort of why you want to do that is, let's say you want to use the email in a relationship, or you want to pass it forward to a different endpoint. The use case, I can't think of one particularly right now, but the point is, what you don't want to get caught doing is pull all that data into your application, parse it in your application, pass it all back up to the API Toolbox, and then get more data back and have to deal with it again, right? So if you want to, you can parse data at the source if it is helpful for your application. Not required, but that will work, okay? You might also encounter weird stuff, like if you have an ID that's a string. That's actually a number, but it's a string. How many times have you seen that?
Oh, more times than I want to.
Yeah, more than 0, which is how many times you'd want to see.
Or a Boolean, or some other crazy
something
thing.
crazy.
So,
right?
Yeah.
So it's a string that it should be actually parsed as a data type, and we let you do that. Nothing too groundbreaking, but it's just nice to have, and it would be sort of questionable if we left that feature out. So that's why it's there. Okay. So let's go ahead and query the user's instance. You know what? Let's refresh our memory real quick on what is in this model. Okay, so we have the ID, it's an integer, the name is a string, username is a string, and the email is an email. Okay, so let's go ahead and query that user. We're going to get user 1. Sometimes the remote data provider is a little bit laggy based on various. We're not actually running this data provider locally, right? So it might have some problems. All right, there we go. So now it works because the data provider actually responded. So what we get is the ID is 1, the name is the name, username is username, and you notice the email is parsed into the name, which in this particular case, it was just an email address, so the name associated with it's going to be null, and then the address, which is the email address. Okay? So modeling kind of segues into relationships, but do we want to stop and you have anything you want to clarify on modeling, you think?
Oh, I think we are actually moving at a great pace, and it's being pretty clear. Right. Corey, how are we doing on time? Is the recording looking good and in focus?
We're doing great on time.
Okay, cool.
About 20-ish minutes into it.
All right. Okay. Well, lock and load, guys.
That's not what the timer says. But
yeah. We don't want to bore you to death, but there is definitely a lot to get through.
This is where it gets good, guys. This is my favorite part. So.
Yeah. My favorite part is when my mouth starts to get dry and I can't talk anymore, right?
Yeah. Get excited, everybody.
So modeling and filtering, taking care of that. Okay. So what can we do with models that is a little bit more interesting than just filtering fields? When we're working with various databases, so something like SQL, has relationships encoded in the data structure itself, right? So you have primary keys, you have your foreign keys, and what this basically says is you might have a one-to-one, you might have a many-to-one, you might have many-to-many. So based on those relationships, you can start to formulate a, using like an ORM, you can formulate a data model for your application, right?
Yeah.
It makes querying that data a lot easier.
So if you think about it, most APIs are being run by a relational or non-relational database or data structure,
Yeah.
and then they have to expose that to you with in a way that relates the different API endpoints. But generally, the way the relationships are made are pretty improvised, or they're denormalized.
I mean,
which
maybe not.
Yeah,
who knows?
maybe not. So that's the inherent problem.
That's a problem, right? Because
Yeah,
it might be one way, and it might be another.
So now you have to put the pieces back together.
Yes.
And this is where we come to help you.
Yeah. So one of the tools here is adding relationships. Pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, it demands a little bit of explanation. But the point is, if an API doesn't specify relationships, or even if it does and you don't want to use the relationships that it specifies, you can start to define your own. So we're going to talk about how a post is related to a user. So if you remember the post data, it has a user ID. And this, you might guess, stipulates that a user authored a post, right? And indeed, one user authored one post. Now that user might have authored multiple posts, but it's a one-to-one relationship, or I don't know, many-to-one, right? So essentially, what we're going to do is describe how our endpoint posts is related to our endpoint users. Okay, so again, this is building up our example. We have the one for the modeling, so we didn't change anything about the model except we added a field to our posts model. And this stipulates the relationship between the post and the user. Okay, so what does this contain in it? First of all, the type is related. The reference, so ref, it references the user's endpoint. So we've defined the user's endpoint down here. And then it has this little moderately arcane section called reverse. So what we probably want to talk about is what the heck is reverse and why should you care? What reverse does is lets you specify what parameters, identifiers, headers, et cetera, you want to pass to the user's endpoint. So what we don't do is tunnel out of our network and back into our network. So you're not actually going through the user's endpoint per se, but it's as if you were making a call to /users yourself. Okay. So remember, if we wanted a single user, we needed to pass in an identifier. So /U/user/1. The identifier in that case is 1, and that's what lets us get that single user. Remember, we have a single user ID for a post, so we want to make sure we're passing an identifier forward so that we can get a single user. Do we have to? No, we don't have to, but then the relationship is wrong, right? If we don't pass that identifier forward, then we're going to get a list of all users tied to a single post, and indeed all users tied to every post, and that is crazy and not right. So we do pass that identifier forward. Now, what is the identifier? In the case of calling /user/1 explicitly, the identifier is 1, and we specify it. In this case, it's actually the evaluated parameter attached to the model. So the model has a user ID on it. Remember, that's part of our field. It might be 1, it might be 10. And what we do is dynamically evaluate the identifier as we're doing this hydration, and then we pass it forward to the user's endpoint. So if the user ID is 1, then it evaluates identifier 1, and then it effectively calls /users/1, and it will map a request to the outbound route /users/1 with this identifier here. So you got 2 dynamic evaluations, and you pass forward that parameter that was originally parsed from the data on the post. Okay? So the other thing here that's different, we call basically hydrating that relationship is including that field in the final result. We do not do that by default. The reason we don't do it by default is because there are cases where you wouldn't want that data. So we assume that you don't want it because that saves network for you and it saves network for us. It basically won't incur, like, so let's say you had this crazy hydration and you made a request and you accidentally said, populate this. It's maybe going to be a whole bunch of API calls. So we don't want that to happen. So we whitelist it instead of blacklist it. So how do you say populate this by default? Well, we just give it the populate directive right on the endpoint posts. This star right here basically means let's crawl all the relationships. So if we had a further relationship on the endpoint, like user data, and it was related to users, it would also do that hydration. So you can imagine like it would hydrate the user first and then data on the user and then wait for everything to be done and return the final result. We're going to probably release a workshop video about what you can do with this parameter there because you can limit what you actually hydrate. It's not just star. So if we had two related fields, you can specify which one you wanted to hydrate, or both, or neither. And then if you had dependent hydrations, there's also a format for how you would do that on the dependencies as well. But the star is just easy and quick in this format that we have here. So let's go ahead and make that call without any more discussion. We don't care about our models collection anymore, so we're going to open up the relationships collection. And we're going to query a single post. And you can see here that the data that we get back is the post fields, user ID, ID, and title, and then the actual user that we hydrated in. Okay, so it's essentially making two API requests to tippycode.com and then waiting for both of them to come back, formatting the data, and returning it to you. Okay, what if we don't actually care about this user ID anymore? So we care more about what that user ID represents, but we already have that user, so we don't care about the user ID. That's something that you can deal with pretty easily. So all you need to do is go into the user ID. We say its type is an integer, right? And all we do then is serialize false. Okay? And all that does is, in the final result, don't include user ID. If we got rid of it entirely, then remember the discussion we had before about what would happen if you don't pass an identifier. Well, if you don't have the user ID in your data, in your model, then the identifier here corresponds to an empty string, which is essentially null, and then you get a list of all users. So it's the same behavior. So we do need to include it in the model for evaluation and calculation purposes, but we don't care about actually returning it. So let's save that and hop back over here, send that request, and you can see that user ID is gone. Fantastic. Okay? So shall we move on to caching?
Yes, we shall.
Or is anything confusing about that, you think?
So just to recap, now we've showed in.
There's probably one more thing. Yeah, there's one more thing.
Oh, there's always.
Yeah, there's always someone else.
All right. Well, why don't you go and then, and then I'll continue.
So what I forgot to do is do a list of all posts. Okay. So this is going to take a little bit of time because again, the data provider is sometimes it caches requests, right? So you can see here that it sped up a little bit the second time. So this might be a problem if you inspect this carefully. So we went on our stump and talked about how you optimize the data that comes into your application by filtering fields and everything like that. Then we talked about hydration, and then we query a list of all our posts, and we noticed that the same user is in this data like 10, 15 times or whatever it is, right? So it seems to be somewhat contradictory, right? We're actually increasing the data that you take. This is basically just how hydration is right now. But what we're working on and what we'll probably release is something that lets you specify how you want to serialize it, right? So it might, this user, instead of being a full object, if you were to parse this into JavaScript or Python or whatever language you're working with, this object, it might be essentially the same. So like deep equal to, you parse these two objects and they're deep equal to each other, but they're not actually the same object in memory, right? So you need to pull in a whole lot of data and then you're parsing a lot of stuff. So how do you solve that problem? The API Toolbox doesn't do it right now, but it probably will relatively soon. We have a list, maybe we'll, instead of an array of all the posts, we have an object that says posts, that's a key, the first key, and that's a list of all their posts, and then might have a string reference to a user, and then you have a parameter, a key value users, and then a list of all users that were relevant to that particular batch of hydrations, right? So in that case, you would only have a user once, and you'd only have, or any given user that appeared, they would only appear once. And then based on that reference, you can hydrate that data on the client side. Keep in mind that that would most certainly be an option. So if you wanted this format, particularly for a single element. It's probably more useful for a single element as opposed to a list. You could do either one.
So just to recap, what Steven's talking about is now that we've brought these APIs together under the API Toolbox, and we can do all sorts of transformations and customizations of endpoints.
Yep.
We're talking now about well, now that you're managing relationships inside the API Toolbox, what is best practices? And the answer is we're not actually sure yet. Nobody is, and so we're trying to find ways to optimize the data, make it easier for people to use, and we'd love to have your input. But obviously, this is much better than what's out in the wild with most APIs, and it's much more flexible than what's out there. But it could be better, and we at BitScoop Labs, we want to be part of the conversation of where APIs, microservices, data moves forward.
It's not so self-serving either. It's basically what can we do to make sure that you have what you need to succeed at your business, right? So it's whatever features that let you focus on your core business, your core application, and like we said before, simplify the data pipeline so you don't spend your day on mundane crap and instead work on what interests you.
And this is exactly why there's RAML and Swagger and API Blueprint and 10 others that have come before it and come after, because nobody has really solved this problem well yet. And I talk to developers every day and their frustrations. And this I think is a very compelling approach. And on that note, let's continue on, because we have a lot of great stuff to show.
There's actually not too much more. One final note about this, because you might be thinking about this to yourself. You see that the same user appears in this list more than once. So if you're conscious of how many calls you're making on your API key, which you should, especially if you're getting billed by the data provider, so something like Facebook isn't free, Google isn't free, do we make, let's say this user appears 10 times, do we make 10 requests for that user, even though it appears 10 times here? No, we don't. No way. That'd be nuts, right? So we make one request per API request you make to us, okay? So if you make a single request to /post here, and then we send that out, any hydration request that we make, we hang on to that for the duration of the life cycle of that request, and use it to hydrate repeats. So if you have user ID 1, user ID 1, user ID 1, we use the same user, okay? So we're not, even though this is 100 posts and 10 users, we're not making 100 requests to users. We're making probably 10. I say probably 10 because I don't know if all 10 users are used for this list or not, but if they were, then it would be 10. So let's talk about...
And you could only imagine managing this type of hydration dynamically on your own. You'd have to write some pretty complex and optimized...
You definitely would have to write application code, but the issue then becomes if the relationship change or you want to modify it, then you have to change your code. You have to do a redeploy. You might have to do a rebuild. Everyone has to re-download. Then you got to support 2 versions, and it's just...
And your solution is probably very brittle, and it's this...
Yeah, it might be, and it might not be. You don't know. But the point is, this is there to make your life easier if you want to use it. All right, so there you go.
It's a great tool in our toolbox.
Yes. Okay, so caching on our system. So we make outbound HTTP requests and HTTPS requests, okay, to simplify everything and to cut out all the BS. That's what we do, is make requests for you, right? If we make the same request more than once, sort of an over-the-top feature we have is caching on our system. So if you want to add caching to an endpoint to reduce the number of calls that you make to a data provider, you can do that using the API Toolbox. There's one caveat there. It's actually probably a few caveats, but the most important caveat is a lot of the providers, the data providers, explicitly say, do not do this. Don't do it. And we can't sit there and police you necessarily, but obviously you can't use our system to abuse their system. So you need to make sure that you're reading the license agreements of these various data providers and obeying those, because that's kind of not cool if you're not. But certain APIs don't care if you cache, right? And if that's the case, and you just want to reduce the latency of your calls, you want to speed up your application, you want to do all these things that caching improves, then you can go ahead and do that. And it's actually pretty easy to do caching on the API Toolbox. So this demo is very short. So let's open up caching. So we'll see the source code here. We actually don't have the user endpoint because it was just redundant and sort of confusing for the purposes of this. But all we need to do to cache is add a cache directive here with an expiration time, and it takes care of the rest for you. So we say expires in 15 seconds. So that's just a regular number, and it is in units of seconds. So what other things are coming along the pipes for caching? Right now, we use the headers and query parameters and path of the final URL as the cache key. That might not be what you want. Maybe you want to exclude certain parameters and certain headers from that cache key so that if you sent an outbound header, it would deliberately collide with another cached value. We don't have that in there right now. This is a sort of a bare minimum caching solution, but we're working on that. So if you want to define a custom key, exclude fields, determine how you would, or rather specify how you would create that key, stay tuned soon. So there you go. And that's why this is an object. So instead of having like expires 15 on the top level, we do cache, right? And then expires within that. And then you can imagine the additional stuff that I just talked about would be also in that object. So let's go ahead and make this request. Unfortunately, we're not running a local data provider, so we can't really tell when a request is cached or not. But if you want to see this in action in a little bit more detail, you can check out the caching video. I'm essentially in that video, I'm running a local data provider and a provider map side by side. And you can see the data come in and it caches as you would expect. And you make a second request and it doesn't hit the data provider. Yeah, right? So just explaining how caching works at this point. So that's how you implement caching. And I'm going to go over and I'm going to run it just for the sake of completeness, but it's not going to do anything interesting.
So as he runs the request, I'm going to interject here and say that I think caching is a really compelling feature of the API Toolbox.
Yeah, for sure.
And I'd very much like to know from our audience where they'd like us to take it, because I think that where we take caching could go a few ways. Caching would allow us to, say, be the fallback if your API went down.
Yes, yeah, that's a good point.
How we might use it to, say, save money on throttled or pay for APIs, save money or
within the bounds of the EULAs.
Yeah, would be very interesting, and I'd love to hear people's experiences with pay for APIs like Google or Facebook or IBM Watson or Wolfram, say, which we've run into, and then the speed up because we are on AWS, which is a really great cloud service,
yes.
And we might be much closer to your end users than you are. So our caching layer has a lot of potential for speeding up your applications. If you're interested in where caching is going or where we should take it, or you have some feedback, please reach out to us.
Yeah. We obviously have a trajectory in mind for the caching, as I talked about the features that we're going to add there, but you can definitely influence where it goes based on your feedback. So we've made a request and it cached it. So there you go. There is one thing to bring up here. How do you clear your cache? And that's why we opened up this request. So if you cache stuff, you don't necessarily have to wait for it to expire. You can send a purge request, so the purge HTTP verb, to the object API, so API bitscoop.com/providers, the ID of your provider map, /cache, and it only accepts one verb, and that's purge. And what happens when you submit that request is it clears the cache for that provider wholesale. It doesn't do any select endpoints or anything like that. It just clears everything. If you update your provider map and save it, the cache also clears. The reason that is the case is because if you change any endpoints and stuff, the cache keys become invalid. So it's pointless to keep it around. They might still be valid, but we don't do any diffs on the provider map right now. So we can't tell if a particular endpoint changed versus the entire provider map. So it's rudimentary in that sense. But that's mostly okay. And if that bugs you in particular, just let us know. I know it bugs me, so that's something I'm working on as well.
There's solutions where you can break apart provider maps and things like that.
Yeah.
Or you can talk to us if it's a real problem, and we'll put it on our backlog.
Well, I guess sort of a side note, when you save a provider map, right now it just overwrites the provider map, so it's just a put request. So you can't patch a particular field in a provider map. and also what we haven't done is versions. So let's say you and a coworker are both working on the same provider map. How do you take precedence over which one is working and which one, or which one you want to use and which one you don't? It's the most recent one, as it is right now. What we're going to do probably in the near future also is add versioning to these provider maps and be able to merge in diffs. So if we merge in diffs for these different provider maps and intelligently calculate that, then we can have a little bit more guided clearing on that cache when you save it. So again, stay tuned for that. I don't have an ETA in particular, but soon. Definitely before Half-Life 3. So there you go. All right. Of course, now that I say that, Half-Life 3 is going to come out tomorrow.
Keep saying that.
Right. I'm going to stay up late tonight and finish this. Okay, so how do we deal with authentication? This is the last sort of big deal, big topic that we've got going on. If you're familiar with a lot of APIs, you probably know that the authentication is not necessarily easy. So we've dealt with this open API, doesn't have any concept of a user, doesn't have any concept of are you allowed to use me or not. It's just there for you to use. Okay, that is almost invariably not the case. So a lot of stuff you run into in the wild is what we call three-legged authentication and authorization workflows. So that would be stuff like OpenID. If people still use OpenID, there are a couple people who still do. OAuth 1, OAuth 2, and then there's various custom authentication schemes that are a little bit more annoying to deal with. But what OAuth 2, we're going to demonstrate OAuth 2 using an app that we created on GitHub. And what that lets you do is basically use the BitScoop API Toolbox to generate the keys you need for one of your end users, and then use those keys to use in this case, the GitHub API on their behalf. Okay, so if you're familiar with signing into various applications, something like, I don't think GitHub does social sign-in, but I don't know, there's lots of products that let you sign in with GitHub, sign in with Google. That's what we're talking about. That's the three-legged authentication. And the three legs of that are the data provider, your end user, and you. Okay, so how do you deal with that workflow? Well, there's some SDKs, depending on the language you're using, but there's some problems with those, and some of them can be a little annoying. So we felt, obviously, that if we're doing an API product, we need to deal with this authentication. So we did. So what do we need to preface this example with? First of all, we created an OAuth application already to save some time here. We did it on GitHub because GitHub is fairly straightforward. But what you get when you create an OAuth application, if you're not familiar with this process, be sure to check out some of our workshop videos for authentication because we'll be going over that in more detail. But it's sort of out of scope of this, and we don't want to drag this on too much longer. So when you create an application, generally what you do is you just you get provisioned an ID and a secret key. And what these let you do is they don't let you do anything, but they're used by the data provider to issue those keys for your end user that I talked about. So these values are used for the encryption process. The application name, the URL, the description, that's all sort of fluff, and that's what you see when you sign into something with GitHub. That's the information that's visible on that page. It basically just identifies your app to your end user. So you don't need to drag any of that stuff over to the API Toolbox because it's not relevant to getting keys. It's just letting your users know who the heck you are. What is relevant is the authorization callback URL. So generally how this process works is you redirect your user to your URL. They are now on the data provider's page, and they're greeted with a page that says, do you want to give permission to Joe Schmo's application? Yes or no? And Joe Schmo is asking for these permissions. You get to review those permissions. You get to say, yes, I want this. Please allow these jokers to get my information. So after that process is done, in this case, GitHub will redirect that user back to another URL. Generally, if you're doing an application, you need to code a URL that then parses the fields, the headers, and stuff that GitHub is going to send to you. We do that for you. So every provider map that has an authentication block has a provisioned URL on the auth API. So that's auth.api.bitscoop.com/done. So that's completing a connection. And then the ID of the provider map. Okay. So this is sort of a catch-22, right? So you need to have a provider map before you can enter the authorization URL, right? But you need to have an app to have an authorization callback. So you do need to maybe put in a placeholder there at first, but it's not really a big deal. So we have this application. We've signed into this BitScoop demo user on GitHub. Let's make sure we revoked all our user tokens. Revoking the user tokens, you ever like log into a service and it doesn't give you the option to approve or deny? It's because you already have a user token and it's already valid. So if we didn't remove all the user tokens and I had run this demo before, it would just redirect and it wouldn't be that interesting. So just double check in there, no big deal. All right, before we do that, so that preface is out of the way, let's just look at our provider map here. So these keys, don't you dare try to take them because I'm going to rotate them anyway. Probably just delete the app because it's not particularly useful. So if you want to use it, you only have like 30 seconds.
All this is well documented, by the way.
Yeah,
I know
yeah.
we're flying through like
all
of authentication, so don't feel like you have to write any of this down.
So what matters is like the big picture here. So we're not trying to just skate over the details because they're not important. They're obviously important, but we don't want this video to be like 4 hours long. Maybe you guys do, I don't know, but I don't want it to be 4 hours long. So the
4 hours long, no, 1 hour long, totally fine.
Yeah. So essentially what we have is the auth type here. The type is required and it's what keys off the authentication block. So it's OAuth 1, OAuth 2, OpenID, stuff like that, right? This redirect URL is not something that matters to the data provider. That is what's specifying on the BitScoop API toolbox where your user should be redirected after they get redirected to this URL here. So we have the auth endpoint, the auth API endpoint there. They're going to get redirected to that. And then once that processes the connection, gets the keys, does all the stuff, we're going to say, okay, now we're going to redirect you to the URL that you specify on your provider map. Okay, so that's the redirect URL here. In this case, we pump it to example.com. It's just a landing page. You guys are probably familiar with that URL. Well, it's an actual real website, so you'll see that. The authorization URL and the access token and the signature, that's going to vary from data provider to data provider. So you're just going to need to do a little bit of research about what you need to enter for those and then shoehorn it into the specification that we have for these various auth types. So covering those particularly is somewhat out of scope. But just notice that the auth key here and the auth secret are transposed from our ID and our secret over here. All right. So we also have endpoints with scopes now. Okay. So what are scopes? Some of you might know and some of you might not. For those of you who don't know, a scope is basically with OAuth 2 and some crazy extras of OAuth 1. Some people do some weird stuff. Basically with OAuth 2, an end user says, I want to give permission to this application, but only for these scopes. Okay, so you might be awarded the scope for, in this case, repo and repo status, but not for something else, which means if we had another endpoint that used a different scope and they didn't approve that scope, then you couldn't use that endpoint without getting an error. Okay, so the scopes just specify to the API toolbox what permissions should we ask for. If we had multiple endpoints and you had different scopes on every endpoint, so the question I'm answering here is, why do we put scopes on the endpoint? So we have an array of 2 elements here. Okay, well, why do you need to do that? Why can't you just put scopes on the very top level? You can do that, but oftentimes an endpoint has specific scope requirements. And what you're doing as an application developer is calling multiple endpoints, okay? So to keep everything organized and to help you out, what we did is we have scopes. You can find them on the top level, but you can also define them where they're most important, and that's on the endpoint. And what we do is every endpoint that you're going to be using, we concatenate all of them together and then take a unique list of them and then request all of them for you. So that translates really well into the auto documentation for APIs, which is a feature that we'll probably be releasing soon as well. So again, it's just in the theme of organization and helping you out and making sure all this stuff is clear.
Yeah, so to recap, API permissions suck. The best implementation of API permissions right now is OAuth 2 scopes.
Yep.
But even that kind of sucks.
They're all right.
But we think we think our provider maps make API scopes and scopes in general, whether you see them on weird APIs or what have you, a lot easier.
We definitely piggyback off of OAuth 2 scopes.
Yeah.
But the point is obviously just let's keep them sorted for you. Okay, so that's probably discussion that went on a little bit too long for something so straightforward. But now you know, right?
Can you tell we love talking about this?
Right. So, okay. So now that we have all that out of the way, how do we make connections to this provider map, and what is a connection? A connection is an object in the API toolbox. So it's an object that's tied to a provider map that represents, sort of represents and conceptualizes one of your end users and the interaction that they have with your provider map. Okay, so if you have 100 users of your application, or you have 1 million users of your application, each one of those users is going to have their own connection. On top of that connection, so rather in that connection, what you're going to have is the various authentication keys, whether or not the connection is completed, whether or not it's authorized, just different properties that help you assess and make requests to the data provider on behalf of that user. Okay, so there is a little bit of a difference between dealing with authenticated APIs in this way and the examples we had before. So we're going to make a connection. We're going to complete the connection just so you can see that redirecting process. And then we're going to make a request to this endpoint to show you what we get. And that'll be pretty much it. So let's go ahead and do that. So three-legged auth example. Let's create a connection to the GitHub app. Now, one of your end users would not be making this request. So you wouldn't be making this request as an XHR XML HTTP request from the client. You just probably wouldn't be doing that. Okay. What you would be doing instead is, let's say a user went to your sign up page. You would make a request to the BitScoop API Toolbox, and what you get back is this result. Okay. So you have the ID of the connection that you just created by sending a post request to this URL. So the ID of the provider map / connections. And then the ID can be used to identify that connection, obviously. The redirect URL is where in the world should you send your user. So it is a lot of just junk attached to this, but it's used to negotiate that authentication process and obtain the keys. So what you do is you take that redirect URL from the request or the response you got back from us, and you return a 302 to your user to that location. Okay, pretty straightforward. So what we're going to do is spoof that process. So we don't have an application wrapped around this, obviously. We're just running this in Postman. But we do need to visit this URL and pretend to be a user just so that connection can be finished. So we're going to copy that. We're going to paste it over here in this other tab and get rid of those quotes because that is not a valid URL. And we're going to send it. Okay, now with all that aside, we have the page that you might recognize here, right? So the permissions that it's asking for are repositories, which are the scopes that we specified for this endpoint that we are requesting. We know we're going to be requesting for. And we're signed in to this demo user. This face kind of looks like a Minecraft creeper. It's a little weird. And then we're going to authorize this application. Okay, so let's go ahead and authorize. All right, what happened? It was probably too fast to see, but essentially your user, based on that application that you created, got redirected to auth.api.bitscoop.com, and then very quickly, our API, our auth API, negotiated that connection, got a key, and then redirected the user to example.com. Okay. Notice that the redirect URL here is example.com, and the actual result is example.com !, connection ID equals this stuff. Okay. Why do we attach that to the connection? Well, you're going to have a landing page for all of your, probably all your connections. So they're all going to come back, and you just need to know which one is authenticated. Okay. Another workshop video that we're going to do relatively soon is how you would make these connections stipulate uniqueness. Okay, so if you have one person, you don't want to have them every time they visit that sign-in page making a new connection. You probably want to keep one user, one connection, right? So you can stipulate that a connection is unique based on a certain property in the metadata, and that's something we're going to cover. So there you go. And when we have this URL, we just know that that connection ID is completed and we're good to go. So now that that connection is completed, we should be able to see it right here. Okay, so we have our access token right here. So I talked about before, a long time ago, or like 3 minutes or whatever it was, I don't know, that we don't want to keep you locked into BitScoop and we don't want to keep you locked out of BitScoop. Okay, so we want to make sure that you have access to your access tokens. We also want to make sure that if you have any existing connections, you can potentially put them on BitScoop and use them seamlessly. Okay, so if you just wanted to use this for the authentication, remember, you can do that, and then you can export your tokens and then use them in your application. But we have all the data here for you that's pertinent to that particular connection. All right. So with this connection, we have this ID right here. What we're going to do is make a request to our endpoint repos. The only difference here is that we have an additional header, X connection ID, with the connection ID. And this is a Postman evaluated parameter. So when we made that connection, it saved that in my environment. So what's going to happen is that's the ID of the connection. We're going to send this, and you can see we have a list of all the repositories through GitHub. So it does all the signing for you. It does all the everything for you that you need in order to authenticate that request to GitHub. And of course, if I wanted to clear all my connections, I just send a purge request to that collection, and now they're gone. So that pretty much wraps up the very basic introduction of what we had for you.
Awesome, awesome. Well, we're going to show you one more thing. Now that you've eaten your vegetables, it's time for dessert. So,
man, give me a little bit of credit.
No. We got you through the entire API toolbox.
I'm like a delicious kale smoothie.
Oh, you bet.
With awesome apple
It's
juice.
so good for you.
Oh, absolutely. Heavy on the kale, though.
Yeah.
Heavy on the kale.
Oh man. Okay. Okay, so
we love talking about the API toolbox and Postman and all these tools. So,
yes, newsflash, I'm a nerd. So the what sort of a theme of a lot of the updates we have in the pipeline right now are how to make this process easier on you guys, because we felt that we put in a lot of effort to make sure that the API was stable and that everything was working the way we wanted it to. The specification was nailed, stuff like that. And now we're iterating on the front end, and we are making sure that, we have to make it easier for you to create provider maps. So one of the big things there is we feel that we need to have examples for you. Yeah. So we went out and we found a lot of data providers that are pretty popular that people use, and we started to map those out. So you can use those to learn from example. You can use those directly if you use those in your business. And then also, if you notice any problems with them, what do?
You contribute or you post issues.
And
anybody can contribute. So here, why don't we pull up the...
what do you want, the GitHub IO?
Yeah.
Okay.
Why don't we pull out our new community.
Okay.
So here is our new provider map index.
Yep. So we're working on this page, and these map to...
So these map all to GitHub. You can click on one in any of them. Like let's click forward into the GitHub one on GitHub, just to be pretty meta. And here you'll see the you'll see a provider map for GitHub and some of the listed endpoints.
Yes.
You can.
But just keep in mind the if you go into GitHub and then look at the JSON, there you go. So that's a provider for GitHub. This one is obviously not scope complete. We're still working on them, so you might get some updates there. But there is that repository that's all open source.
And you'll probably see a Postman collection next to the provider map, so you can test what you've built.
That is coming soon as well. So you didn't see any Postman buttons on the API Toolbox, but we love Postman, and we want to make sure that it's easy for you to test your provider maps. So having a Postman export, something that you'll see.
You'll probably see templates in this provider map index, like a basic framework for OAuth 1 or OAuth 2 or or multiple endpoints. You're probably going to see all these great APIs that we have here. You're probably going to see alternate versions of an API. So maybe like a version of Google that's done for consumers, or for Google a version of the Google Provider Map that's done for enterprise.
Yeah.
We're gonna do a lot of great stuff here, and you can submit your own provider map, say an alternate Facebook one or your own API, and this will all be a great community. So here's our site. We put a lot of work into it. You can filter down to see exactly what you want to see, and for all those people who came this way by LaForge, you'll see that we've left the space open for the LaForge Social Flow API, where there will be a provider map and Postman collection soon.
So probably, I guess a question for Corey is, I mean, your LaForge API is going to be probably just publicly accessible HTTP sort of thing.
Yes.
So you'll probably just do OAuth type stuff that we talked about, like OAuth 2.
Very simple web-based standards. Nothing new. We're going to get out of the way. We just want people getting on board and getting it going.
Yeah, and I want this whole suite of APIs right here. See me touching his computer. This whole suite of APIs right here is just primed for development. So if you want to build a LaForge mod or a website or an app, it's a great place to start is with these provider maps. They're like Lego blocks for data.
Yep. And so, I mean, obviously you'll see big ones like Facebook and stuff like that. A lot of times you need to, just a side note, you need to apply for production keys for some APIs, so they're not necessarily open. We don't right now handle that process for you, so you come to us with your API key, and then we store that securely for you. So we don't, some of these we personally don't have access to, so you might be the expert and you might find some issues, and like we said before, just feel free to let us know if you run into problems with that.
Our dream is to help everybody map all the APIs out there as a communal effort. So we stop everybody writing a Facebook connection.
Tasks.
Everybody's writing a Twitter connection. Let's write one collaboratively that everyone can use and be the best one.
And then if you wanted to fork one down and pare down the endpoints and modify it, at least you have a baseline. So there you go.
Yeah. It really is awesome. Okay. And with that, we're gonna conclude this live stream.
Yep.
Thank you everybody for watching. I know we ran pretty long, but that's because we had a lot to say, and I hope you liked it.
Well, so definitely we'll be doing more of these in the future, and then we'll be putting out more videos. Like I said, the workshop videos. So stay tuned for that. This one is, like Liam said, is probably relatively long compared to the other ones, just because we got a lot of stuff to go through. But we just want to frequent contact and let you know where stuff is headed and why it's headed there, and then give you a chance to interface with us as we go along our merry way.
Well, shout out with questions and comments, guys.
Yep, thank you.
Bye.
Bye.